up online probably later on this afternoon, maybe tomorrow morning. So if you need to come back to it as reference, you'll be able to do that. And then I also want to briefly introduce my co-presenters today, who will talk more about themselves when they get to further into the webinar. But joining me here in Sacramento is my colleague, Amelia Oliver, who's going to be doing more with the grants, starting with your program, the grants that you've just acquired through us. She'll be working with you on species selection. Some of you she already has. She'll be doing a lot with the account and preparation of the quarterly reimbursement reports. And then she'll be doing a lot of the reporting directly to CAL FIRE, but she'll also be working with some of you explicitly on the day-to-days of your grant, which she'll go into a little bit more, probably offline. We've already determined some of the folks that she'll be working directly with. And then also is Colleen Rabden. She's the founder and chair of Urban Ecos. She'll talk a little bit more about herself, but we are really excited to have her contracted on this grant with CAL FIRE. She'll be calculating all of your GHG reductions on your behalf, and she's already assisted many of you in species selection and where to place your trees. So again, we're really excited to have her, and she'll be talking later on. I think right now we're just going to dig in. We hope to keep this to about an hour, and the reason that we did have this required webinar is that we're managing grants from a couple years ago, and we've just realized that this is something that we found to be very useful for the grantees moving forward. There are a lot of templates that we've prepared for you that all of you should have received a couple days ago, and we're going to spend time on those templates and discussing what's involved in terms of the material that we need from you on a quarterly basis going forward for the next year plus. So with that, I'm going to dig in. There's 3 parts to the webinar, and we will try to break after each part for a few minutes to take questions, and then again, questions at the end. So let me see if I can get this going. Okay, so one of the things that you should have received in the multiple documents that I sent you is this checklist. And this is pretty straightforward and something that I recommend you using when you're preparing your quarterly reports. This is essentially a list of everything you need to be including in that packet. And your reports really do break down between progress report and quarterly reimbursement request. The difference being that the progress report is mandatory every quarter. The quarterly reimbursement request, you don't need to submit every quarter. If you've had only a couple $100 in expenses, or you haven't had any costs, then that's something you don't need to complete. But the progress report is something that needs to be done every quarter, and that does come with a series of attachments. So this is a good checklist to just have at the very beginning of the process for you, so that you can just mark it off each time that you are integrating something into your report. Due date. We have definitely learned from some of our past experiences that it's important to reinforce the due date. We've decided on the 10th day after each quarter, so your first report will be due October 10th. I know some of you signed your grant agreement in June, which means technically you've had a report due on July 10th. We decided that was unnecessary, and we're just going to combine any information that was gathered or performed by the grantees in June. That's going to be captured in the report due October 10th. But I really just wanted to dedicate a slide exclusively to this, is that we're operating under pretty tight conditions to get all of your information provided to us, compiled, processed, checked, and then disseminated to CAL FIRE in a pretty short period of time. And I think I even go into that on the next slide. So a couple of the reasons why we're fairly diligent about the due date of the 10th, and that's for 2 hard copies mailed to us and also an electronic copy, is that we're trying to get funds out to you as quickly as possible. And if one group is late, then that delays the process for us, where we've had to hold everyone back for up to 2 or 3 weeks while we're processing the reports. Again, one of the things that I just mentioned is that our information, our responsibility at CAL FIRE is to compile all the information that you provided to us and get it to them in the last day of the month. So we're only giving ourselves about 20 days to compile the information, not only from the 13 grants that comprise this cycle of funding, but also the 20 from the previous cycle. So, you know, we also like to provide plenty of time for technical assistance with the grantees if reports come in and they're missing materials, or there's some quantification that still needs to be completed, or census tract data filled out. So that's why we're really diligent about having those in on the 10th, so that we have that full 20 days to complete this and get it to CAL FIRE. And then, as I note here, supplemental submissions, they're going to create much more work for you. They're going to create additional work for us, and it's going to delay the process. And really, this all comes back to what I started with on this slide, is that we want to get everyone paid as quickly as possible. And we're in a position to do that if we can get those reports in. Legislation that was passed last year allows CAL FIRE to do advance payments to us, so we can hold those funds in our account, so that once we've checked off that we're comfortable with your work, your progress report, and your quarterly reimbursement request, we don't have to wait for CAL FIRE to check off on it. We can say we're confident we've done this right, and we can issue you a check at that time. So what we've experienced though so far is that actually saves up to a month, maybe even longer, in getting the funds to you, but it all depends on you getting the material to us. So, as you know, I sent a lot of material to you over the last couple days, and we're going to go through each of the pieces kind of one by one to talk about areas that you may have concerns about, or areas that we want to highlight as places to especially pay attention to. The first piece is the progress report itself. This is really a minimally altered version of what CAL FIRE requires of us. It's a PDF, you fill out the fields, and you can see here that a couple of things that I wanted to highlight on the first page is the information that's expected, which is how much you spent this quarter, how much match, expended to date. This is all going to be reflected on your invoice as well, which Amelia will talk about later in the presentation. But one of the common mistakes that we'll see from grantees when they're submitting materials is that the invoice won't match up with the front page of this report. And then we have to go back, find out why, and then that puts more work on the grantee to resubmit with the correct information. So it's a really good idea that when you're doing your invoice, make sure that you're just taking those pieces of information and putting them directly into here. The other one that I wanted to focus on is the trees, and this is something that you're going to need to report quarterly, the number of trees you planted, and then you can calculate that to the total to date. But you'll also see on here that there's other plants. This grant program does allow for other green infrastructure and other vegetative cover. It's not a focal point. It's not going to reduce GHGs, but it's something that CAL FIRE wants to keep track of in terms of how these grants are contributing to other green infrastructure. So when you are doing other plants, you need to capture those as well on your tree reporting form, which Colleen will discuss more. But you'll see here that it's very clear about needing to identify each of the plants and the trees that you're planting, even though the trees are the ones only being counted for the GHG reductions. The other material, however, is self-explanatory, but of course you can always call it, ask questions. The other thing I wanted to highlight, and I believe this is on page 3 of the report, is the census tract information. And we have found from previous reports that folks can, submit 6 numbers, 4 numbers, a zip code. We're looking for the 10-digit census tracts that are consistent with Cal EnviroScreen, which, if some of you I know are previous grantees, this is the mechanism developed by the Office of Environmental Health and Hazard Assessment to determine what qualifies as a disadvantaged community in California. So that's the model that we're going to be utilizing to make sure that the project work that you're doing is in a disadvantaged community if you have one of those grants that's been designated for that. The other thing that you're going to see here is that it asks you to identify how the project is serving a disadvantaged community. So one of the pieces that I sent you is this one pager that I've highlighted here that shows how CAL FIRE and the California Air Resources Board have determined what qualifies as a project located in a disadvantaged community. versus one that's serving. You can see it's pretty straightforward, especially located. If the majority of your trees are planted in a DAC, then it's a DAC project. We're not really doing projects that solely provide benefit to in this round. I listed here just so you could have a sense, but really the focus is going to be if it's located in, then it's a DAC. If it's not, then it's not a DAC project. Photos. Each time that you're out doing a project planting, or especially if you're looking at the project site right now in terms of planning for how you're going to plant it, grab some photos. Before and after photos are really important. Action photos, especially with people in it, are really important. Photos that represent some of the equipment that you've been using to complete the project. And then, of course, all projects have to education component, so those photos as well. And these serve multiple purposes. They're a visual backup to demonstrate that you're doing what you're saying you're doing in your progress reports and in your quarterly reimbursements. They're also information that CAL FIRE uses to share with the state agencies to demonstrate that these projects are meeting the goals of AB 32 and subsequent legislation relating to the California Climate Investment Program. But they're also tools that help tell the story. It's a story that we want to tell to communities in which you're working, to CAL FIRE, to the Air Resources Board, but also to the legislature. And as I said at the very beginning of this presentation, I'm also our Director of Public Policy, so I also do lobbying on behalf of California ReLeaf, and a focal point of my job is to try to continue to get funding to CAL FIRE and other state agencies to support urban forestry and green infrastructure. And the stories coming out of members' districts and their communities that they represent are really powerful, much more powerful than me just walking into an office and listing facts and figures about urban forestry. So when you're out on your project site, grab pictures. When you're doing a volunteer event, grab pictures. And of course, you know, in this day and age, everything's digital, so it's a low-cost exercise that has a big bang for the lack of buck. Onto the volunteer tracking form. This is something that we've been told by Department of Finance in previous audits that they want to see. They want the proof that the volunteers and the volunteer hours that you're stating in your progress report and in your quarterly reimbursement form are connected to physical bodies. So what we do ask is that you have a volunteer sign-in sheet at all of your events, both for education events and planning events, but of course your tree planting events as well. You'll see up in the upper right-hand corner that there's an event start time and end time. This is something to be completed by staff. This isn't something that every volunteer needs to come and check in and check out. Kind of the honor system on that one, where staff should just set the start time and end time and make sure it's included in the sheet. But we do ask the volunteers to put the basic information of name, address, and date. We do understand that in some communities there's a real reticence, especially in severely disadvantaged communities, to include an address. If your volunteers are hesitant to include an address, we just ask that you please at least include a zip code. So far, we found that most people are fine to do both, but we just want to make that recognition that we understand and we've communicated that to CAL FIRE. And so if we can have at least a zip code, that's great, but a full address is even better. And then one of the things that I wanted to point out is that this template that I provided to you, I only put our logo at the top as a placeholder, but there's every expectation, and we'll go into this a little bit more when we get into acknowledgments, that you're going to put your logo there. So here was a grantee that we had from the past that put theirs at the bottom. We don't need to be represented on your volunteer sign-in sheet. You should be represented on your volunteer sign-in sheet. So I simply provided the template, but make sure you put your logo somewhere on there where you don't need to take you can take ours off. That, I believe, is the end of the first part. So I'm going to go over here to my question sheet, or my questions column, and see, it looks like there is a question. I just wish I could read it. Wow, that's a long question too.
You see who it's from, you can unmute them.
Let's see. Oh, it's from Natalie. Hi, Natalie. If you're not serving a DAC, do we leave this section blank for the volunteer tracking form. Can we use our own version? Yes, Natalie, for volunteer tracking form, you can use your own version. To include a liability, you know, Natalie, I think I'm just going to try to take you off mute because for whatever reason, I can't see your question all that well. So give me just a second. Let me see if I can do this. Natalie, can you hear me and can you respond?
Natalie's typed in that she does not have a microphone.
Okay.
Oh, okay. Sorry, Natalie. Let me go back.
Question. It says, if we're not serving a DAC, do we leave this section blank? And so I think that's probably that census tract section.
Oh, yeah, that's fine. Thanks, Natalie. And what was the rest of her question, Colleen?
And then the other one was, can we use our own volunteer tracking form to include liability statements as long as the info included on the sheet are included?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's no problem with that. That's actually a really good idea. Thanks, Natalie. Okay, let me see. And Colleen, I'm glad you can see the questions. That looks like our only question. That looks like our only question at this point. So I think with that, I'm going to try to turn control over to Colleen, who will tell a little bit about herself and then guide us through the next section. So Colleen, you should have control right now.
Okay, let's see if I do. Just give it a little second time. I feel like it needs to warm up. No, still, oh, there we go. I think we've got it now. All right, everybody, thanks for joining us. Some of you I've worked with in the process of applying for this grant, and I guess we've got some folks working who are recipients of this grant that have been working with California ReLeaf and me in the past on the earlier one. So thank you all for being here. As Chuck said, I'm an urban ecology consultant with now a pretty strong background in greenhouse gas work. So many of the tools that we use for the greenhouse gas calculations I helped to develop. And so I guess that gives me the expertise to help you all do the calculations. And we've discovered in the process of the previous years that it really is just easier for me to do this, to take this burden off of your shoulders, because there are so many ways for it to go wrong. It's very complicated and weird, and it changes with every grant. So we will take this on for you. But what I'm going to walk you through today is the information that I need from you in order to do a good job of calculating the greenhouse gas benefits, and also what we need from you to meet our requirements from CAL FIRE's perspective. What they expect from us is what we expect from you. And so I do want to emphasize, I think we've got 3 grantees that had a previous California ReLeaf grant that was the same general idea. This one, the reporting has gotten a little bit easier. The form is maybe a little bit more elaborate, but it's going to save us from making mistakes. From my perspective, the greenhouse gas calculations have gotten a lot easier. We no longer have to collect emissions information. So we're not going to ask you what kind of car you're driving, what kind of gas mileage it gets. I think from Chuck's perspective, you do want to track your mileage because you can get reimbursed for that. But we don't no longer use that and all that other information to figure out the greenhouse gas emissions associated with driving your vehicles back and forth to the site or anything like that. So for those of you who did have a grant before, unfortunately, you're going to have to sort of keep both methods in mind and use the old way for the old one and the new way for the new one. And feel free to reach out to me anytime you get confused about which one is which, because we can definitely help you figure out how to do that. So let's get started. There we go. So here's our new Excel spreadsheet. It's called the MDCA for planted trees. And this is where we're going to ask you to track your tree planting information. This is a little bit of an extension of a form developed by CAL FIRE itself to try to help minimize the mistakes we were finding in the data. And some of these fields have drop-down menus that you can choose from. Some of them have limitations, and I'm going to go through them all and talk to you about them. And then at the top, there's this blue section here. I'm not sure you can see my arrow. And then there's a green section here. And inside of those are calculations that happen automatically. And you can use those. You'll use the numbers that come out of those automatic calculations to fill in that PDF progress report that Chuck talked about, where he said it's really important for what's on the tree inventory sheet to match with what you type into that PDF as your progress. Those need to match. So let's just tackle this bit by bit. I'm sorry, I know this is maybe not the most exciting thing in the world. You can sort of see down here at the bottom, there are a bunch of different, tabs. I touched that too hard. The first one is instructions. And so I've tried to make this PowerPoint presentation something you could refer to as a manual. So it has more words on it than I normally approve of in a PowerPoint presentation, but I want you to be able to come back to it and look at it. But you can also turn to this instruction sheet that's the first tab on the spreadsheet to get an explanation of what's going on here. So let's run through it. So the first thing for you to enter there at the top is your grant number, your grant name, your name, the name of your organization, and the reporting date. This, I would say, almost always gets left off. And so it's really helpful for me if I'm looking at a spreadsheet to know which one I'm looking at. And I'm just going to actually take this second here to plug something I forgot to put in this presentation. It's super helpful to me if you rename this spreadsheet with the name of your organization and something that reflects the time period we're talking about. I have every quarter now about 20 spreadsheets named the exact same thing, or name some crazy name that it doesn't make any sense. So if you can change the name to say something like Urban ReLeaf's 2Q 2018 report, that would be very helpful, just in me keeping them all straight. All right, so that's the first box. Second box, as I mentioned, is the planted tree. So this is all calculated automatically based on what you fill in that spreadsheet with. So don't mess with this. We want it to do its math by itself. So here we have, going from left to right, then we have the little gray names are the headings that tell us what's going on underneath. So number 3 is the tree number. This needs to be a unique number over your entire inventory. So it shouldn't be 1 through 25 in the first quarter and then 1 through 25 in the second quarter. It would be 1 through 25 and then 26 through 50. But even better would be if the numbers were sort of more unique than that. So I think Jimmy Scheid, who's the CAL FIRE rep for Northern California Coast region, he recommends that that unique number reflect something like the planting date or the person who planted it, or presumably in many cases, these aren't the only trees that you'll be inventorying. So something that reflects the fact that this is a ReLeaf grant. Think of this as we want you to be maintaining an inventory of your trees. And so the number can be whatever you want, but we would ask you when you say, we removed tree number 25, we know which tree number 25 you're talking about because there should only be one. So the funder, this is a drop-down menu, and in that box goes either CAL FIRE, which is California ReLeaf working under the auspices of CAL FIRE, or it's a matched tree. And this helps us keep our reporting to CAL FIRE straight, as well as to make sure that the grantees, you all are accomplishing the parameters that you set forth in your proposal. In the next column is the scientific name, and that's please the scientific name. So there have been cases where I've had to track down. There are a lot of trees that have the same common name that are nothing alike. And so I need to figure out, are you planting this one or that one? One's really big, has really high greenhouse gas benefits, and the other one is really small and doesn't. So we would appreciate the scientific name of the species there. Number 6 is just the street address. Number 7 is optional. It's more address information. So you might use that to track if the trees are being planted in a park or at a school. If your inventory method means that you prefer to say we're planting trees on the west side of the building or around the corner or something like that, you can use this for whatever you'd like. Or you can just leave it blank. The city is also got a drop-down menu, has all of the cities in California. That was CAL FIRE's preference there, so we're going to go with that. So just choose your city from the drop-down menu. Keeping going, ownership, public or private. Now, I don't think we've yet had any trees planted on private property. So this is also a drop-down, but public is definitely going to be your most likely choice. The only case where trees are planted on private property would be in the case of a giveaway where you're giving trees to residents for them to plant in their yard, and I don't think that we have any trees in our programs that fit that category. So just if you have any questions, just let me know. Then the next thing is the Y coordinate, and that is a number that should be something on the order of 37. So California, that the Y coordinate is the, I always have to think my way through this, the latitude. So how far north, starting at the equator, is your project? The entirety of California fits within the latitudes of 32 and 42. So there's a limit in these cells that won't let you enter a number that does not fit inside that range. Then similarly, next to that is the X coordinate, and that's the longitude, how far west of the whatever the Greenwich mean line that runs through England is. And so the entirety of California fits between -114 and -125. And again, if you try to enter a number that doesn't match that, it will not let you do that. And the numbers need to have 6 decimal places of accuracy. So I'm going to talk to you about why that's important and how you're going to get these latitude and longitude coordinates in just a few minutes. But just know that those are the limitations set on the cell. Then is the census tract. And that is a 10-digit number that starts either with 60 or 61. And you can find that on the Cal EnviroScreen website. And I think I'm just now realizing I forgot to show you a good way to do that. But we can talk about that if anybody has trouble finding the census tract that their trees are planted in, they can reach out to me. I think in most cases that was something that you included in your proposal. But if you can't come up with that, then just let me know and I can fix that. Then the next one over is the DAC status. And I should have included the whole spreadsheet here, but another tab along the bottom of the spreadsheet is DAC guidance, and it helps you understand which of those categories that it falls in. So there's 1A, which means the trees are planted in a DAC, and then Chuck sort of mentioned this too. There is sort of the 2s are things that help a DAC but are not themselves located within a DAC. So your number should be one of those values, 1A, 2A, 2B, 2C, 2D. Values like 85 to 89% are not correct. So you would get those from the Cal EnviroScreen, and they talk about how disadvantaged, what percentile of disadvantagedness a particular census tract falls in. But that's not the number that we're looking for here. We're just looking for that. In what way does it benefit a DAC, not how disadvantaged is the community. 14 is a date planted, just a regular date format there. The stock size, this is a little bit different from, we were sort of unclear about this before. Don't measure the DBH or the caliper of these trees. We're asking you for how big was the I guess technically the container that the tree was planted in. So some of the options there are 5-gallon, 15-gallon, 24-inch box, bare root. And from that, we will sort of apply to everyone an average diameter that will keep things a little bit more even across the board. So again, that's a drop down. You can just choose the most appropriate stock size there. It should save us all some trouble who trying to measure all those trees. Let's see, then there's the grow space. And so Cal Fire has a requirement that I think trees have to be planted in a space that's no smaller than 24 square feet. So 4 feet by 6 feet is the recommended minimum. So in this box goes either the amount of square feet, if it's a relatively moderate amount, like 24 or 36. If it's a pretty big open space, then you can just describe the area itself. So you might say that it's a 12-foot median, or it's just open if they're planted in a park or in or school grounds or something like that. So the tree status is new or replacement, and this is how I'm going to try to do a better job of keeping track of how many net trees we're planting. So you should be aware that in this grant, if trees die during the course of the grant, then they do need to be replaced, and we don't get credit for those trees. The replacement's just, right, we subtract one and add one, and then we end up essentially with the same number of trees. So I just need to know if the trees are new or replacements. And then the last one is this little yellow box called GHG Benefits from Shading. And this is how, this thing has got a mind of its own. This is how I can determine if your trees, I can calculate the benefits that would be associated with shade. So as we talked about as we were applying for these grants, trees that are planted to shade buildings in a strategic way can help reduce our energy use associated with air conditioning, and that reduces greenhouse gas emissions at the power plant. In the hot and dry parts of California, the hot parts of California like the Central Valley, the Inland Empire, that benefit can be as big or even bigger than the amount of greenhouse gas benefits from the tree sequestering it itself. So if your tree is within 60 feet of a building, then you want to take the time to fill out this information. If it's not, like if they're planted in a park and there are no buildings around, don't waste your time with this because only trees within 60 feet get some credit for this. If they are shade trees shading a building, then I need to know the distance to the nearest building, and then there's a drop down again. So this just fits into classes, 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, or more than 60. And again, more than 60, stop right there and don't go any further. And I'm going to talk more about how you can figure these things out in just a minute. And then the last column is the tree is to the direction of, tree is to the blank of the building. And so I've formulated this as a little bit of a sentence because what we're trying to do is say the tree is south of the building, but it can actually get pretty complicated if you're just like, which direction is it from the tree to the building? Well, do you want the tree to the building or the building to the tree? So I like to leave it as this little sentence so that you can say the tree is to the south of the building, and then that's also a drop-down option. Previous calculation methods did not give energy benefits to trees on the north. We have a new calculation method that does give some benefits to these north side trees. So in contrast to the way that we were doing things before, please feel free to enter trees that are planted to the north of buildings if they're within 60 feet. So I think that is, I'm going to stop right there. I see I have a couple questions, so let me see if it makes sense to tackle them right here. I'm going to actually there's two questions. Chuck, why don't you review them? They're not really related to me, so I'll let you think about it while I finish up, and then maybe you can come back and address those questions. Okay, so that is the CAL FIRE, what they call the MDCA form, Minimum Data Collection Attributes. And here we've included in the spreadsheet that we sent out to you a sample form so that you can just know generally what it's going to look like when you're finished. All right. So let's talk about latitude and longitude and how we figure these things out. I said we need to have enough digits. And so what I'm showing here on the top is this is a tree, and here are its latitude and longitude coordinates with 6 digits. This is the tree, and this is what that number is showing. Down here we have 4 digits. So all I did here was chop off those 2 digits at the end. And instead of being, this is where the tree actually is, where the red arrow is pointing to. The white arrow is pointing to the site that is associated with that latitude and longitude that only has 4 digits. So it's actually 2 houses away from where the tree actually is. So that's why 6 digits is really important to get us accurate enough information that when you go out there and look for that tree again, it's where you think it is and not, in this case, as many as 2 houses away. So how can you get latitude and longitude? There's a couple of ways. One is in the field with a GPS device. And so this used to be more of a thing than it is now. I can't even remember the names. Trimble was this famous company where you had that little device and you used it. The only thing that it could do was find out the latitude and longitude. But now your phone actually does that just as well and probably better, and pretty much everyone has one. So I think that using your phone is probably the easiest thing. What you do not want to do is use the default iPhone Compass app. And this is just a screenshot from my phone. First of all, it does the latitude and longitude in the wrong format. It can translate it, but it's complicated. But nevertheless, even in that format, it does not give you the accuracy that you need. If you take this latitude and longitude that's down here and translate it into decimal form, oh, sorry everybody, and translate it into decimal form, you're only going to get 4 decimal points, and so it will not work well enough. In a second, I'll show you a free app that does a better job. And you can also do it back at your desk, which in fact might even be the easiest thing to do, using either Google Maps or Google Earth. So this is my little, do not use the smartphone app that is native to your phone. I do not know how Android does in this matter. It might work just fine. So that's something that you could look into, see if you're getting enough accuracy and if you're getting the right format. So my personal preference is an app called Commander Compass. I think it's free. If not, there's a pro app that might be as much as $3, but you can charge that to the grant. And you can see up here is my latitude and longitude, and at 6 decimal places, I'm getting the accuracy that I need. So in order to get the format the correct way, you just need to go under the settings and under geographic coordinates, choose the one that looks like this down here at the bottom. So that we don't want any, there's like 10 different formats you could use to show your latitude and longitude, but we want this one that's at the bottom. Hang on, one thing I will say again, what I'm going to say right now, if you decide to collect latitude and longitude out in the field, the thing that you will do wrong for sure is not stand next to the tree when you're trying to calculate it. So that's just a big red flag to keep in your own mind. Maybe if you're going to make a data sheet, you put at the top in big letters, stand by the tree. What people always do is stand a few feet away, look at the tree, and use their location to determine the tree's location. But if you're 4 feet away, that's a big enough difference to make quite a difference. So the person who is holding the device that captures the latitude and longitude should stand right next to the tree. Okay, and so the other way to do this is to use Google Maps or Google Earth. And so the first step to this is probably to print out an aerial image of the site, and then you're just going to draw the locations of the trees wherever they are. So in this case, I'm just showing a little bit of this, but here is one live oak tree, and here's another one, and here's another one, here's another one. And then down here, unfortunately cut off a little bit, are some deodar cedars. So when you leave the field, having planted your trees, you've got this aerial image that you printed out, probably from Google Maps, and you've drawn on it the trees and indicated their species in a way that you can keep track of. Then back at your desk, you're going to take your drawing on one side, and then you're going to go to Google Maps back on your computer. And then here was the spot where our tree was. So then if you right click on that exact spot, you're going to get this little menu. And if you just say, what's here? Then at the bottom, the latitude and longitude are going to appear in this box. See them down here? And there they are with 6 digits. So just exactly the exactness that we need. And here I've said, cut and paste. Don't try to type it out. So that's another really easy way to make a data error, is to try to write, to remember 36.744639 and get it straight. Instead, just copy and paste that into your Excel spreadsheet so that you have fewer errors. Another way to do this is in Google Earth. And so here you can actually just use this little pin here, drop it on the spot where the tree is according to the way that you drew it on your map, and then you're going to get this little piece of information. And here, I apologize, I forgot to change the way this displays so that it shows in decimals, but you can use Google Earth, the settings there, to say, I want to see it as a decimal, and I want to see 6 places of accuracy. And then again, you can cut and paste this from Google Earth into your Excel spreadsheet. So let's talk about the distance. Hang on, I'm gonna do one more quick view of my questions here to see if some of them again make sense. And then, yep, I'm gonna get to some of this. And then I'm seeing that somebody's having a trouble seeing the drop-down menus in the Excel file. So that's Vladimir. I will go back and have a look at it again. They are unfortunately a little bit finicky. So I'll just make sure that the version that we sent out is got everything working the way that it's supposed to. And I will get back to you on that. Okay, the distance and the direction to the building. So as I said, we've got four categories. 0 to 20, 20 to 40, 40 to 60, and 60 feet. So how are we going to measure this? There's 2 ways to measure it. One way, especially if you're working with volunteers, that I think can be quite interesting and fun for them, is to take the time to teach people their pace. And so if you know yours, you can just do that. But if you're going to work with volunteers, you would maybe set out a little piece of tape on the ground that's one that's a start line and then one that's 30 feet away, and ask people to walk at a normal, what feels totally comfortable to them and normal, that 30 feet, and count how many paces they take, and then divide it so that you know how much each step represents. So let's say they do it in 10 paces, 30 feet divided by 10 paces is 3 feet per step. And then they can just walk from the tree to the building and measure the distance using their pace. Another way to do it is to come back and do it in Google Earth. And then I know these pictures aren't so easy to see, but here is a little ruler in Google Earth that lets you just click right here on the tree spot, and you click on the nearest building, and it tells you here how many feet it is. So this tree is 19 feet, so 0 to 20 feet from that nearest building. And then, as I said, what is the direction from the building to the tree? Since it's so easy to get this backwards, frame it this way. The tree is to the blank of the building. And in this case, we see that the tree is to the east of the building. Because it's so easy to mess this up, and because most people have a really hard time knowing which direction is which, like me, I have zero sense of direction. It's really, really easy to get this backwards when you're in the field. So I think it's easiest to come back and just look at your trees on a map and see which direction they are from the building. But this is something that you can practice. And if you find that you're doing an accurate job of it in the field, then by all means, go ahead and just track that data in the field. So in this example, tree number 245 is 0 to 20 feet to the east of the building. So that's pretty much it that's related to the inventory and the greenhouse gas benefits. One thing we did want to talk about is the issue of substituting species. And this relates to, Ken had a question about this, that this is the time to talk about it. In your proposals, you suggested a set of species that you would plant. And we know that that's not always possible. Sometimes those trees are not available from the nursery. Sometimes the trees of that species that are available from the nursery are poor quality, and we would definitely want you to we want you to walk away from a bad quality tree in a nursery. Sometimes they just are, you discover in the process of doing the project that the school where you wanted to plant them, the principal hates that kind of tree and it's just not going to work. So we took your proposed species list to CAL FIRE and they approved it on our behalf. So we're going to have to go back to CAL FIRE and get approval for your species changes. So we need to do that in advance, if at all possible. We would only make a few exceptions where there's sort of an emergency situation in that case. And we're going to look at the same things we looked at in the first place. Is it the right tree in the right place? Thinking about power lines and diversity and things like that. Does it have comparable GHG reductions? And so if you proposed planting a whole bunch of oak trees and instead you come back and say we want to plant flowering cherries, then that's not going to be a substitution that's going to be okay, because we promised CAL FIRE that we would achieve a certain greenhouse gas reduction with this program. And so in order for us to meet our agreement, we need everybody to meet their agreement. But if you come to me and say, I promised to plant a red maple and I really don't like the way they're looking in the greenhouse, in the nursery, I want to plant London plane tree instead, then it's very possible I'm going to agree, because those would be, in fact, the plane tree would be even bigger probably than the maple, so that would work fine. We're also going to think about water usage. We cannot take a very drought tolerant palette, because that was a pretty big component of this grant, was thinking about drought and pests and diseases, and substitute in things that do not fit that same vision of the kind of trees we're talking about. Trees for the 21st century, we call them. And then Chuck has included cost here, and that's a little bit outside of my purview, but yeah, maybe he can, perhaps if he wants to, he can address that a little bit more. But I assume that just means you can't swap a cheap tree for an expensive tree.
Yeah, that's pretty much it.
Okay. Or I guess we've also had some cases where people wanted to swap a 15-gallon tree for a 24-inch box tree. A 24-inch box tree is much bigger, less likely to thrive, and much, much, much more expensive. So it's not that we will always say no to that, because some cities have requirements about that, but that's definitely something that we need to think about in advance. And so here is my final recommendation for doing a good job and keeping an inventory. Whenever possible, don't let people write down numbers, just cut and paste where you can. When you're out in the field, let people measure the distance from the tree to the building, but I think you're safest using a map image to figure out the direction. If you're using your phone or a GPS device, stand right next to the tree. I promise that this will happen to everybody at least once. And then measure the distance and direction to the nearest building. And that might not be the most obvious one. And by that, I mean, I've seen some cases where people are planting trees in a park and they just don't think about the fact that the trees across the street from the park are actually within 60 feet, and those can be really beneficial. Or you're planting trees to the north of a building, a street tree to the north of a building, say, but there's actually a building on the other side of the street, so the tree could actually be benefiting that building, which may be closer. And then finally, practice a few times with your small knit team with your equipment and any data sheets that you create before you go out there, especially with volunteers. That's just the best way to find any glitches that you might find that you've organized the data on the sheet in a way that's not efficient. Just make sure by practicing, actually trying it, get out there, just walk out the door and do that tree that's right next to your building as a way to give a test run to your methods there. So that's my part. I think I got one more question down here. So Pamela is asking, is it possible to provide a list of trees with their GHG quantities so we can need to substitute, we can look for availability of a species that's comparable or greater? It's not really, because the list is now so long. And besides, you're gonna have to, well, there'll be more than just the GHG benefits that are relevant here. If you do need to make a swap, then just drop me a line and we'll talk about, I'll give you some ideas about where you need to go from there.
Thanks so much, Colleen. And you have a better view of the questions than we do.
Okay.
So have we fielded all the questions so far?
We have. The thing I'm most worried about is Vladimir is saying that he's not seeing the Excel file working properly with the drop downs. So maybe I want to make sure that the one they got, can you send me the one you sent them so that I know we're looking at the same thing? And if there's a mistake, we will resend out a version that works better.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay.
So before we go to and thank you, Colleen, for that detail about the tree reporting form. So everything that we've discussed so far, that's the meat of your progress report. So we're going to transition into the quarterly reimbursement request, but first, I want to recognize that I know we're going to go past an hour. If some of you have to get off the phone, then please do come back and look at the recording that will be up our website in the afternoon. If you think you can stay on till about 1:10, 1:15, I imagine we'll be done by then. And I do see a hand up from Nicole. So Nicole, I'm unmuting you right now. Is there a question that you had?
No, it was answered.
Okay, great. Thanks, Nicole.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so now we're going to transition into the quarterly reimbursement request. And some of the most common hurdles we really want to address in the next 10, 15 minutes have to do with personnel costs, the templates that we're providing, and then just how the supporting documentation, which is so important for getting reimbursements, and it allows us to move forward with reimbursing you without having to get that permission from CAL FIRE, as long as we've got the confidence that what you've provided is going to work for when they do report it. So I'm just going to dig right into it. The most complicated part of reimbursement requests has to be the personnel costs. And part of that is that there's so many different ways to look at personnel costs, and we're going to try to hit all of them. But one of the things that we need to start off with right out of the gate is a template that we provided to you, which is a summary of the time that your staff and your match personnel spend on the project on a week-by-week basis going over the quarter. So you'll see here that what we've really tried to do is create a very, very simple framework for doing that by allowing space in the Excel document provided for you to include the month and year that you're reporting on. So, presumably you'd have 3 of these for each quarter. And then some slots that we put in where you can identify the personnel that you're reporting on and the rate of pay. And then there would be a match as well coming from personnel or other sources. You can include that as well. And of course, we're not talking about volunteers. We're talking about staff. So if you have a project manager that is 100% on this project and we're covering 60% of their time, but then their other 40% is already being recorded on here, then you would have that person in the personnel column and rate of pay, plus they'd be in personnel match. So this is a form that we devised because when we were audited by the Department of Finance a couple years ago, which is a standard practice by the Department of Finance for grantees, they told us we needed something that across the board showed personnel costs. So this is not a substitute for your organization's own timesheet. It's just something that we request you do. And once you have your timesheet from your organization in front of you, this should actually be fairly easy. But I just wanted to bring it to your attention and then show you an example. So this is really a good example of what we're looking for. And you can see it really is just filling in the number of hours on a week-to-week basis for each of the months that you identify. And if you've only got one person, then put in that person. If it's only match staff, put in that, and that's going to match up later with the reimbursement request that you're submitting through the invoice and the other forms that we request. So that's really just a quick glance at this. Then we're going to transition into your own timesheets. And these are how we actually reimburse you for your time spent. And we don't have a template for this because, much like Natalie asked earlier, can you use your own forms? Of course you can use your own forms. We're not asking you to revise how you keep track of your time and your personnel. We just need to be able to clearly understand which of the hours that are being reported are applying to this grant, and this is a supporting documentation or examples of supporting documentation that we'll accept. But again, this is just an example. This is for personnel. When you're talking about contractors, that's a different form that we'll get into, but just wanted to stress, this is what you'll be needing to send to us for reimbursement for your staff costs related directly to the project. There's not a lot of people in the past grants, but there are a few that have also wanted to include benefits. That's fine, as long as there's supporting documentation. And this is a couple of examples of how grantees in the past have been able to show us benefits for their staff. And this, again, these are just examples. You can have other computer-generated sheets that will allow for this. Of course, you don't have to include benefits, but it is completely permissible if you want to capture that in your personnel costs. We're just going to need the supporting documentation. I talked a little bit about different invoices for consultants and contractors. Here's a couple of examples. Everyone's seen this, invoices for various services. And the good thing about this is that you can just present the invoice from the consultant and contractor, highlight which of the pieces within that are pertinent to the grant. In a lot of cases, it'll be all of it. And if you're submitting this, this is not information that is captured on the sheet. And I'll go back a couple. That information is not captured here. Again, this is just for staff and related match staff expenses. The consultant gets their own individual, they'll submit to you an invoice, you'll pay it, you submit it to us. Now, if a consultant is doing match work, you would still submit this invoice, but then you'll just put on it that it's match, and we'll capture that as well. And I think that's really it about personnel. Again, if you have questions, and I'm sure you will in the first quarterly reporting, do feel free to call me. But now I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Amelia Oliver. For those of you who are returning grantees, she's the reason that you get paid in a timely fashion. But she's going to be doing much more on this grant, and we're really excited to have her more fully integrated into the process. So, Amelia?
Can everybody, well, if you can't hear me, let me move a little closer. Colleen, will you let me know if you can't hear me, because you're not muted.
You're coming through nice and loud.
Okay, great. So I'm Amelia Oliver. I've been with California ReLeaf for a while, and I do the operations part of ReLeaf existence. And so I get to submit those invoices to CAL FIRE on a quarterly basis. So I've been reviewing, I don't review yours individually, but I compile our invoice for our reimbursement. So I'm pretty intimate with the process and what CAL FIRE wants and doesn't want, and what they look for in audits and things like that. So we're trying to come up with a procedure that is clear and easy. So a new form that we have that we're going to be rolling out with this particular, with your guys' grant, is this reimbursement request invoice. And this is basically your cover sheet for your invoice that you're submitting to us. It is pre-entered with your, when you get it, it will be pre-entered with your budget. Everything in red on there, in red text, will be entered by us. So we'll be entering your grant name, grant number, as well as your budget and match budget. So all those things in red will be hard entered in. You will not be able to change them. They'll be locked. You will be entering in the parts that are showing in white on a quarterly basis. So you'll be entering in your big picture personnel costs, which includes contracts and benefits if you're including them, trees, supplies, equipment, each of those categories. You will be entering in your quarterly totals, and you will come up with a request at the bottom, which circled there. I have control of this, right?
Yes.
Where is it? Down here, this will be your total request to us for that quarter. There will also be your expenses to date. Since this is Q1, they are not showing, but these will be your running totals as well as what your budget balance is. And the same is going on for your match. You'll be entering them in. At the bottom of this form, when you get it after we've entered your budgets and we'll send them to you, are tabs. All of the invoices you'll need for this grant are on here. And when you submit them to us, you'll be of course, you'll print out the current invoice that you're working on and include that with your hard copy, but you'll be sending us this entire workbook. I do advise that you save it before you send it to us, otherwise it will not have your most recent entries into it. And you will be, okay, let me go to the next page. Here's a sample of one filled out that we just came up with. We have here in red the hard entered budget. This was a $20,047.50 grant. That's what they requested from us. In this column, we have their quarterly request, which is $2,398.94. Do you notice that none of these numbers are rounded? Those numbers are precisely, they match your receipts perfectly. Here we're going to check off that we have the receipts. That gives you you need to make sure that they match what your receipts are showing, and then you will be able to see your expenses to date and your balance. Please note that cannot be negative numbers in your balance. They have to be positive. If you by chance find that you are running high in one area and you need to possibly revise your budget, you need to tell us that and work with Chuck or myself before you get to that point when you're submitting your invoice. Up here in the corner is the person, the date you're filling it out and the person filling it out, and then down here it must be signed. And let's see, was there anything else on here? Admin costs. I do want to say you can claim admin costs, which are things like mileage, or what else is an admin, Chuck?
Cell phone.
Cell phone, but you do need to show receipts. So that's an important part of getting reimbursed, is that we have all the receipts and that those receipts match. The total of those match. Let's see. We're providing a template for a receipt reporting form. This is really to help you out. It is a form where you can add lines as you need them, and it is a place for you to list your receipts, and the amount of those the amount that you need to be reimbursed is over here, or whether it's match. So when it says here, for instance, trees include stock, that means from Peaceful Valley Farms we have a receipt, and out of that, we bought trees, and the total we're requesting from that is over here in the reimbursement. This is a log of your receipts. If over here we have what's called the invoice receipt number. A really nice way of keeping track of your receipts is to number them. So let's go to the next page. So there's a sample one. Here's one filled out. So you can see here in tree supplies, we bought some tools from Home Depot, $203, and that is receipt 4. This helps us figure out, to find out where your numbers are coming from and make sure that they match. And you can use the same receipt for other categories. Let's say you bought some trees at Home Depot, which I hope you didn't, but if you did, that would be up here, and it would say the same receipt number here and the total of that receipt that was pertaining to that category. Also on here, you can see that personnel was written down here. These are the totals that came up on your timesheet that you filled out for us, as well as your contractors. So those are all receipt numbers. All right. For admin, to show your backup for admin, you have, you can make your own mileage sheet, but you would, if you're going to ask for reimbursement for mileage, you need to show us your mileage. You need to show how many miles were traveled, and you use the most current. It may change in January, so you got to make sure that you have the correct mileage amount that for the year that you are asking that reimbursement. Let's see. I want to go back up one moment. I'm sorry. I can just tell you for overhead. Let's see, one more back. Overhead down here, or excuse me, indirect or overhead is the same thing. You do not need to show receipts for this part of your budget. For everything else you do not need to show receipts. Let me think. I think that is all that I have on reimbursement. Oh yes, 2 hard copies must be submitted and postmarked on the 10th. Chuck already talked about how important the timing is of this, and we keep one and we send one on to CAL FIRE. And what is your last bullet here? Incomplete electronic submissions probably mean incomplete hard copies. So send us electronically the same stuff you're sending us in the hard copy versions. And
then one thing that we'll do, and Amelia talked on this, I'm just going to go back, just skip over one slide, about the indirect. Of course, Amelia covered that you don't need supporting documentation. What we are going to ask you is that you're claiming indirect proportional to your direct costs each quarter. Don't let your indirect costs build up. Don't think about that as kind of a bank that you may cash in later on in the process for a lump sum, because that will not work. You need to be claiming your indirect costs in direct proportion to your direct costs on a quarterly basis. Most of you had indirect costs at 10%, so claim 10% of your direct costs. If you had it at 8%, claim 8%, and then if you had a fiscal sponsor, whether it's 8%, 5%, 10%, include that there. That's also the indirect cost. So really important to do that, because if you just have indirect costs later on that have built up over time and you haven't claimed on a quarterly basis, it may be very difficult for us to reimburse you at that time, because we're going to be reversing against direct costs that don't exist because you haven't claimed them on a quarterly basis. So one other thing that's less relevant to the progress reports and the quarterly reimbursement requests are acknowledgments. And this has been an issue that we've had going back several years, even to when we had federal funds from the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. The state has put millions and millions of dollars into supporting these new programs with the primary intent of reducing greenhouse gases. CAL FIRE has received over $60 million over the course of 4 years solely for the urban forestry program. There's an expectation that the state will be recognized by grantees for the money that they are investing into these projects across California. So for each of your projects, you're going to need to include this information And the only thing that I ask, which I think we differ from a lot of other grants in this respect, is that make sure to include your logos and make sure to include them first. Yes, we're supplying the funding for this along with CAL FIRE and their resources board and the governor and state legislature, but this is your project. And it's important for you to highlight you and your partners in this project up front so that that's a tie back directly to the community, and your face is the one that we want to see on that. We just need to make sure that you're also acknowledging the partners at the state level that are making it happen. If you have any questions about that, you can certainly feel free to contact me about it. So
Can I jump in, Chuck, with just 2 quick things there?
Yes, please.
One is if you're making something really fancy, you got a graphic designer on board, and like maybe you're making a brochure, an informational brochure or something. We can provide you with these 3 logos that are transparent on the background, so you can make them look nice there. And in other projects I've worked on, if for some reason you can't fit all of those words on the side, like maybe you're making a big banner, of course this will fit, or you're making a handout, then you could put these words in small font. But I don't know, maybe you're making a plaque that's going to go on a tree. Some small changes to those exact wording have been allowed. Like mainly, I think they'll let you leave out California Department of Forestry and Fire Protection and just put CAL FIRE. So there's a tiny bit of flexibility in the exact wording if for some reason you just can't fit it all.
Yeah, thanks, Colleen. So closing comments, I know we're going over here and I want to leave opportunities for questions. Can't stress it enough, 10th, your first report's due on October 10th. I know that the template we sent you for the invoice is all blanks. We wanted you just to see that as an example. As Amelia said, over the next couple of weeks, we'll be sending you out each your very own invoice template that will have your specific budget included in it. You can submit materials early. Quite honestly, a lot of people don't. Don't submit them too early because we want to make sure that you're capturing all your information, and that's the earliest we'll be able to get to them is the 1st of the month each month. Obviously, use this as a resource. You've got quite a few people here at disposal. I know some of you already have with Colleen and Amelia in terms of looking at your species and finding the appropriate choices for the geography in which you're working. Consult with fellow grantees, and there's a couple folks that received funds from us a couple years ago that are back here on this grant program as well. So they may be able to offer some guidance into how to navigate some of the materials and work with us as you're moving forward on your project. And then the last thing is that I know we've covered a lot of ground here. This may seem daunting at first in terms of the paperwork, but I think as some of the grantees that have worked with us before, it's really not. It's probably a few hours at the end of the month compiling the materials around your project. Remember, you're telling a story about what you're doing in the community. Don't let the paperwork overshadow what's happening on the ground. That's first and foremost important. This is something that has to be done to meet the requirements of the grant program, but the focus obviously is going to be getting the trees in the ground, supporting workforce development in your community, the environmental education that comes with it. And remember, the time that you're spending in developing this report, you can bill against the grant itself. So I think with that, we're going to go into questions. Colleen, again, I'm going to ask you for your assistance since you have a better view than I do.
Sure. So Ken asks me, this is a question for me. So going back to reporting your the information for reporting GHGs, and I said, look around and be creative about the closest building that your tree might be shading. It could be not the one that you're planting it next to. And Ken asks, is it okay if that tree is on, if the building itself is on private property? And the answer is absolutely. All we care about here is whether a tree is providing shade to a building that will be using less electricity. And so public or private, it's all the same. I wrote an answer to Pamela's earlier question about whether we could provide a list of trees and their GHG quantities, and I can't see my own answers. So I can send out a website to the participants showing you the tool that I'm going to be using now for these greenhouse gas calculations. So you could choose a different tree. You can use this tool yourself to play around if you're trying to get an idea of possible replacement species. So, and then Vladimir asks Chuck a question about the invoices. For the consultants or independent contractors, do you need to know the exact dates that the people worked, or can it just be the total hours on each task in a month on a monthly invoice?
No, it should be the date each worked. There should be that level of specificity. I think if we go back to the, let me see if I can go back to the examples that we put. I think in both of the examples that I listed, that was like the first thing that the contractor listed was what date the work was done. There we go. Let me go back to that. So yeah, you can see on both of these, that's the very first thing listed is the description and the date of the activity. So that's going to help us, and it's going to lend credence to the invoice itself. So thank you for the question, Vlad.
And then we had a question from Natalie about if an organization is receiving discounts on trees or services, does that discount count as a match?
Yes, absolutely. Yes. Yeah, I mean, it'd be great to have supporting documentation from the nursery you're working with that's saying, well, normally we charge $75 per tree, but because we really love the work you're doing in Chico, we're going to give it to you at $50 a tree, something like that. But they can usually capture on an invoice. They'll often be an invoice with a unit price and then a discount. So absolutely count that difference as matched. Thanks, Natalie, for the question.
Okay, and from Vladimir, can the order of words in the acknowledgement phrase be changed? And it like it was in the grant agreement. So I'm not sure. Did we have a different wording in the grant agreement?
The wording that we had in the grant agreement, I'm sure it's similar to the wording that we put up on the acknowledgement signage here. I can look at the two, but I would imagine they've got to be very close together, so that should be fine.
So I think the answer, I think the general was that the idea has to be conveyed and all those names have to be conveyed.
Yes, that's absolutely correct. Yeah, I mean, what they're looking for here is it's less about the words and more about the fact that we're acknowledging that the state is investing millions of dollars in projects across California to reduce greenhouse gases.
Okay, and then we had to go back to one question from Natalie that came in early that I shunted off to you and then we forgot. So that question was, can trees be planted on private property with the owner's permission?
We're not quite there yet. I know that I think in that application there were several sites identified as potentials, and I think you're going to want to focus on the one that are not actually on residential property. It's something that we're working with CAL FIRE on to see if we can get to a place that we're comfortable with, but we're not quite there yet. So we would prefer them to be more in the right of way that the public has control, or that the local government has control over.
I think that's it. Let me see if anything new came in. Oh, hang on. What size of sign is required? Ken is asking.
It varies. I mean, it should be readable. You know, if you're doing a planting event at a park and the idea is to be able to attach the acknowledgement signage to a fence at the park or something to that effect, then, you know, something that in the area of, I don't know, 3 by 4, that's more visible. Obviously, if you're going to be doing little banners that are going to go on individual trees, groups like Friends of the Urban Forest do little bumper stickers that are much smaller than that are probably maybe 3 inches by 8 inches. So, I mean, it really just depends on the circumstance. But, I mean, it needs to be readable. If it's on a publication, which it should be if you're doing flyers for events or spreading the word about this through publication or on your materials, the environmental education materials, again, it should be, you know, readable. Thanks for the question, Ken.
I think that's it for now.
Okay. The vast majority of you stuck with us. I know we went way over time, and we'll take that into consideration when we schedule the next webinar for the next cycle of grants, which will be going out later this year. I really want to thank all of you for joining us. Again, use this as a resource. Thank you so much for sticking with us. Thanks for your questions. And if you have any others, I'm usually around, so feel free to give me a call, or Amelia or Kalaine, and we're happy to help. Thank you so much, and you'll be able to get this downloaded in a few hours off our website. Take care.